this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Air Mini, and this is an RGB installation video where I'm going to be showing you how I went about installing a Phanteks all-in-one cooler and Lian's SL120 fans. Now, I have done a video separately where I unboxed and installed this case using the standard case fans, the 240mm front fan and the standard single 120mm rear fan, alongside a 12th gen Intel setup and a Noctua air tower cooler. But in this video I'm going to be showing you how I went about the installation process to set it up with a slightly different setup, so they give you a variety of options. Now, if you want to find out more about this case and an in-depth look about the intricacies of it, please be sure to check out that original video that I'll link to in the description. But in this one I'm going to be talking to you about the various complexities of installing RGB fans and also what you can do with it. This is a modular case that allows for the installation of a variety of different things. For example, you can mount multiple different radiators in it, both 280 and 240mm radiators. In this instance, as you've seen, I'm mounting a 240mm radiator on the side panel at the back, but you can mount them on the front, the bottom, or the top, depending on your motherboard setup and how many you're installing. The standard 140mm fans are held in place with a bracket. You can install 120mm fans in there instead, or 140mm fans. I would recommend, if you're going to follow this same process, to use Lian's AL140 fans, so that you get the benefit of Lian's awesome fans, but also have the maximum size. This case is really designed for 140mm fans and will be superior in that way because they'll fit in a nicer way. Now, I'm going to be mounting a radiator on the back, which means that you need to take off these back plates. These are used to mount SSDs or platter hard drives, one or two of those, but obviously if you're mounting fans or a radiator, you'll need to remove them and get them out of the way because they will be blocking the airflow, either intake or exhaust, depending on what you're doing, and so they need to be removed and replaced. Now, in this build, I'm using an Intel 11th gen ROG motherboard, and I've done a video separately on this motherboard, but here I just want to show you the installation differences. As I said, in the air build I actually use a 12th gen, and the reasons for the differences is this is my main daily driver at the moment, and I have not finished moving across to 12th gen yet, but I will be. I'm just switching cases so many times at the moment. I wanted to use multiple different setups for this. It also shows the differences in it, and it has an interesting implication in terms of the front panel USB connections, which I will show you in a minute. Essentially, when you're mounting a radiator on the side, it can potentially block the case. Now, if you're going about the installation process, I would recommend doing what I'm doing now, which is installing the motherboard in there before you go about installing the fans. The thing I found with the Mini Snow Edition was that if you installed the fans first, plugging in things like the CPU power connectors that you can see at the top here becomes very fiddly because you have limited space. You can fit 3 120mm fans at the top. And in this case, as I said, I'm using the Lian SL120 fans that I just happen to have in my Dynamic XL case that I did a video on previously. And so I've removed them from that, and I'm now installing them in here. Now, a quick look at the USB front panel connections that I was talking about a minute ago. You'll see on this motherboard, it sticks out to the side. That is problematic because when you go about installing a radiator on this side panel, it will then get in the way. And I want you to note that now, because also things like the power cables for both the fans and for the motherboard could be problematic. This is an ATX motherboard, so it does fill up quite a lot of room in the case, and this case is designed to take ITX, M-ATX or ATX motherboards, so your setup may vary and you might have this problem. Also, this side-mounted USB connection might not be an issue if you have a top-mounted one, which I do on the 12th gen Intel board, so it may vary, but I think it's worth mentioning. This is a 240mm Phanteks AIO, which I'm going to do a video on separately. And that AIO currently has Phanteks fans on it with RGB fan covers. And the complexities of that are something else. Basically has daisy chain fan cables for power and also for RGB lighting. Now, you can install a 240mm rad. Obviously, you have multiple different options. It could go on the front, it could go on the side, and it could go on the bottom. But here I think the side will be the cleanest and easiest to access. The thing here is that you can also install a 280mm radiator, and the positioning of it is interesting, and I want you to note that how far it sticks out into the case. It's going to be very tight against the front fans, and you'll see what I mean about that in a minute. But also, as you can see, I'm realizing now that the USB connection on there is going to be problematic. And I mean, you could abandon using the front panel USB if you're a madman, or maybe look for other options such as a 90-degree angle adapter or something like that. There is another option as well, which I'll show you later in the video, which is to mount the radiator at the back of the case instead of the front. That gives it more room, and that is a surprising thing about this case. It has a lot of flexibility in terms of the mounting position. It's a modular case with a lot of different options in terms of where you can mount things, but also it's very spacious for such a small case. Not only does it take an ATX power supply unit, but it also has the ability to mount multiple rads or multiple fans. So the standard installation process for the way I'm doing it, I'm just going to show you the standard setup for the Phanteks rad first, and then I'm going to show you the SL120 fans on it instead. So what I'm doing is I've installed the fans directly onto the radiator, and then I'm installing the radiator to the case to the back of it on that side panel. You'll note at the top and bottom there is a gap. I would recommend, if you're going about the installation, to not screw those screws too tightly so that you can adjust the positioning of it up or down depending on where you want the gap. This is a pre-applied thermal paste set up with a Phanteks pump head, so that then sits down on there and is held in place with 4 thumb screws. I'm going to do a video separately that goes into a lot more depth in the installation process for that, but I just thought it would be worth talking about how it's set up. The setup on the Phanteks cooler is actually really good. It has daisy chain set up for RGB lighting and for power, both from the fan connections and the pump head, because it has a really cool infinity mirror effect on the attachment that goes on top of the pump. It gives you some really nice RGB lighting that then connects to the RGB header on the motherboard and gives a really good overall visual on it. And you can daisy chain the cables together, which makes it a lot easier, but you can see there's quite a mess of cables here. You have both power and RGB. So the power connection goes into a Y splitter cable that then connects up to the fan cables, so you looping them all together, and then you can then connect them to the CPU header. Or alternatively, you can connect the fans to the secondary CPU header and the pump to the initial CPU header, so you have the option to connect it in multiple ways. I chose to use the Y splitter and put them all into one, which means 2 fans and the pump will go into that single connection. That gives the motherboard the best control of it. And then you have the RGB daisy chain effect, which goes from one fan to the next and then to the pump head. And then at the other end, you connect a cable that then goes to the RGB connection on your motherboard. It then gives you RGB control from the motherboard software of all of these. And it's worth noting that Lian's SL120s and AL120s also have motherboard potential control if you're setting them up. I've done a video separately on the SL120s and the AL120s talking about that, but use the control box that I'll show you in a minute. You can connect that up to the RGB head on your motherboard, and then you can control everything from your motherboard software once you run the sync settings. So at the back of the case, we're then connecting up the RGB and power connections. You'll note the black and grey cables is the RGB connection here, so I'm essentially just taking the daisy chain setup and connecting it to that pump head. There's a lot of cabling here, and running it to the back of the case is important. And this is a point of note, is the difference between this and the original build that I did, which only had the 3 fans, is there's already a lot more cables here. And I think that's one area that is worth bearing in mind when you're setting up this case. This is a very flexible modular case, which has a lot of room in it, and there's a reasonable amount of room for power cables and things at the back. But once you go about the process of installing RGB fans, which necessarily have extra cables and control hubs, you also need extra power cables for the control power, and etc, etc. You end up with a lot more cables at the back. It becomes a lot more difficult to manage. Also limits the number of SSDs and hard drives you can install, in my mind. Anyway, once you run those RGB power connections through to the front, you'll see there's a plus 5 volt RGB header on this motherboard at the top. There's also one at the bottom. You'll need to consult a motherboard manual on that, but again, these are more cables to run back to the back and then through to the front and connect up and make sure everything runs nicely. But what this does mean, because the Phanteks pump doesn't have USB connection, it means that you have no software for that, so it's all run through the motherboard. The SL120s are fantastic fans. If you've not seen my video on these already, they are daisy chainable fans. You can connect them together into groups of 4 potentially, although in this case we're going to have a maximum of 3, because the top of the case takes 3 SL120 fans, 320mm fans, and then you have 220mm fans in various other positions. but the control box can take up to 16 fans in groups of 4. So you've got 3 fans here. You end up with one clip that then has 2 cables on it at the end that then connects to the control box. So we're screwing these fans into the top. We're making them face down into the case so that they'll be exhausting hot air out of the case, out of the top. The included screws with the case can obviously be used to hold these fans in place. If you buy a triple pack of these SL120s, you also get the control box, which is necessary. There are just 2 cables coming out of these SL120 fans, which is one of the ultimate highlights of these because you get a lot less cables than you would with other RGB fans. Corsairs, QL120s and LL120s, for example, have 2 cables per fan. So if you had 3 fans here, you'd end up with 6 cables to deal with instead of just 2. So this setup is a lot more convenient and a lot simpler to do as well. So we're running those cables through to the back. There's a nice little hole at the top right that you can use to run it. So if you set these up in the same way I have, it's really simple to get those cables tucked away neatly. Now, the other positioning for fans are you can install 2 120mm or 2 140mm fans in that front bracket. I'm using 120mm here. I would recommend 140 would be superior. But what you can see here is that with this setup, I am ever so slightly blocking the radiator. I think the camera angle probably makes this look worse than it actually is in reality. But if you use this front bracket with these front fans and you side mount your radiator, you are ever so slightly blocking a little bit of it. I don't think it's going to cause any problems with air with the cooling, so to speak. I just think it is an aesthetic issue that's worth bearing in mind, but a minor one. Again, I'm using an intake setup here. So I'm pulling cool air in from the front of the case and through, and then exhausting out the top. What you will notice, I'm actually also exhausting through the radiator on the Phanteks all-in-one radiator at the moment. However, I'll show you that in my personal opinion, it's better to do it the other way around. And I'll show you that with the SL120s. That way you're intaking through the radiator and the front of the case and then exhausting out of the top. Also intaking down the bottom. Now with these cables, running those through to the back is a bit more problematic. I found this a little bit more messy, but it is possible to run them through at the bottom a little bit with a little bit of fiddling and to tidy things up. Obviously we're going to run the control box at the back, so that makes life a bit easier. At the bottom of the case, we're mounting 2 120mm SL120s and positioning these face down so that pulls cold air in from the bottom underside and blows it up into the graphics card and throughout the case. And you'll note that the bottom space, it looks like it should take 3 120mm fans, but actually only takes 2 or 2 140mm. So 2 140mm would fill this space in a more satisfying way and would potentially offer superior cooling as well. But again, we can obviously set up and install these really easily, screwing in all the screws, and then also just running those cables back to the rear of the case. Fairly straightforward in terms of that. So now we have 3 sets of fans set up in this case with the Lian fans anyway. And obviously those 3 pairs can then be run to the back. So 6 cables to plug into the control box. Now, I initially was going to install another fan at the rear, but I didn't do that, and there's a reason for that I'll show you in a minute. So the control box itself needs SATA power, which is the flat power connector that goes to your power supply unit, USB connection to your motherboard, a RGB header on the motherboard, and a system fan header, preferably with a PWM control. You need to look at your motherboard to find that. And that will then allow you to get system fan control via motherboard software, as well as within Lian's L-Connect software. Again, as I said, I've done a video separately on these fans if you want to find out a bit more in depth about how they work and the setup process for them. You plug in the power and RGB connector cables for each of the groups of fans that you've set up here. So because I only have 3 at the moment, you can just plug in those 3 into the corresponding slots. You can't get it in the wrong position because they're different style of cables. It's a different style of connection. What you will note is that things are now starting to get quite messy at the back of the case. There's a lot of cables to deal with back here, and also you need to find room somewhere logical for this control box to go. I'd suggest that if you're not using the hard drive tray or the back of the cable tidy mount, that you could put it there potentially. Run the cables through to the front, connect to the USB connection for the control box. Obviously the SATA power goes at the back for the power supply unit. We also then need to connect the RGB header. You only need to do this if you plan on using the motherboard software to control the RGB lighting. which makes life a bit better if you sync things up. But you can just use the USB connection and then use Lian Li's L-Connect software to control the RGB lighting if you want. And don't forget that system fan header connection. So here you can see the final setup. Note the Phanteks 120mm fans on the radiator are different from the Lian Li ones. Actually, the RGB lighting looks pretty good. I was quite happy with this setup. And you'll note the infinity mirror effect on the pump head also looks magnificent. That's the reason I chose this all-in-one cooler, because I thought it looked really nice and had a really nice finish to it. But now I'm going to demonstrate how to remove the Phanteks fans and instead use SL120s in their place. This is obviously something you might want to do if you're planning on using Lian Li's fans, but you want to use a different radiator. So this logic will apply to, for example, NZXT's Kraken radiators as well, if you want to do that, or a Corsair radiator. Any sort of all-in-one cooler could apply the same logic. You can use different fans, it doesn't matter, especially with this one where the fans aren't connected to the pump head, for example. So the bonus here, as well, as there is enough room both at the back of the case and through that gap to put your 240mm radiator through and feed it through to sit in the back of the case instead of the front. This is worth doing, and this is my recommendation for doing it as well. This puts it at the back, which makes things look a bit neater. There's also room back there still for the cables on either side, and also enough room to put the back plate on so it doesn't cause any problems with closing the case. Also still gives great airflow because you have the case has those holes in the back of it as well, which you'll see in a minute, and allows for a bit more flexibility. More importantly, it means that I can now plug in the front panel USB connection, and I had less problems with my cables, and the fans sit a bit further back so they're not blocked as much by the front panel fans. So now all I need to do is line up the fans with the radiator and use the long fan screws to screw through the fans and through the case and then into the radiator. That then holds it in place. I managed to do this with a couple of fans, well, obviously just holding the radiator up and then getting it into the right position, screwing a couple of them in, and then laying the case flat, and then going through about the process of installing all those screws to hold the fans down in place. The end result here is that I have a more uniform look and feel with the terms of the fans across the board, but now I have another set of fans, so that will use all 4 connections on the control box for the Lian Li controller. And that is why I didn't install an exhaust fan at the rear of the case, because that unfortunately would mean that I would need another controller for that fan as well, because you need another control box for the fan because it doesn't have a spare port on the control box. So you'd end up with 2 control boxes at the back. So not an ideal setup, but here I have essentially 2 fans intaking from the front of the case. I'm intaking air over the radiator as well, and intaking from the bottom. So I have 6 intake fans and 3 exhaust fans. The exhaust fans being the top ones. And as I said, I can then run those connections through to the back. Now what I'm doing here as well is slightly different to what I showed you earlier on, because I'm connecting the RGB connection from those new fans that I put on the radiator to the control box, but I'm actually using the power connection from those 2 fans, and I'm connecting that to the CPU fan header, the optional CPU fan header. So where I said earlier on that I connected the pump head to the CPU fan output, I'm connecting the fans to the CPU optional extra one, or you could alternatively use a Y splitter to connect the 2 cables together and then have that. But what that means is that I now have the motherboard able to control the fans on the radiator and the pump and ensure that you have proper cooling of your CPU throughout the system while maintaining the RGB lighting from the SL120s using the L-Connect software or your motherboard with the RGB settings, and also having a uniform look and feel with the SL120s throughout. I think this looks really good. It has a much nicer look and feel to it, and also a uniformity. Unfortunately, as you can see, I do think that the 120mm fans on the bottom don't look that great. There's a big gap at the bottom there, and also obviously missing that rear exhaust fan isn't ideal, but there's a limited amount of room at the back for an extra control box, and I didn't have one, to be honest, so I haven't done it, but you could opt for that. The Phanteks cooler, though, looks the part, and this case still runs nice and quietly, and it looks really nice with all the RGB lighting, which is obviously then controllable with L-Connect or with the RGB software on the motherboard, in this case Armory Crate. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Hope you found this video useful, interesting, hilarious, or otherwise. Take a look at these other videos that I think you might find interesting as well. And have a look at the description for links and other information you might find useful. Click that join button to see the benefits of being a member of my YouTube channel. And most importantly, have a great life.